For the rest of the assembly, I'm going to assume that you have already installed all of your connectors. You've already soldered everything. You've heat shrinked everything. That includes your motor, all of your speed controls. You should have 4 speed controls. 2, 3, 4. You should have 4 speed controls, and everything is already soldered for your speed controls and your motors. You should have your power distribution cable, 4 blacks, 4 reds. Some of you have this JT connector that just happens to come out of your cable. You might decide to use that for your camera equipment, or you might not. I decided not to use it. I chose to distribute the power a different way. So I just folded that up and zip tied it out of the way. Your power distribution cable is not quite long enough when you put your airframe together, so you're going to have to make some extenders. I have here, I made 4 extension cables, 2 for power and 2 for ground. So at this point, you're going to need to make some decisions with your airframe. Knowing that we're doing the quad H, you got to pick which side is going to be your front. The way I have this laid out, it's pretty obvious. 1, 3, 2, 4. The way this is pointing, that'll be front. And if you look at your flight controller, you'll notice the flight controller has the word forward on it. That means you're going to have to point your flight controller forward. So since we have that already established, I'm going to get my pen out, and I'm going to just mark over here. I'm going to put a dot for 1. Over here I'm going to put 1, 2, 3. Over here I'm going to put 1, 2, and 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I know where to lay my motors. Once we get to that point, your motors, you'll notice on mine, I've taken out the grub screws that the motors come with, and I've installed these hex heads, socket head, Allen socket head screws. That just gives me more meat to hold on to when I tighten it down. One good thing about this is you can loosen these up, and with them loose you can adjust where you want your wires to be. Let me show that to you here in a second. Alright, we're going to focus on number 1. Corner number 1. That makes this forward. So, what I want to show you is, if you loosen up those heads, what that does for you is it gives you the ability to locate how you want to install your motor compared to where your wires come out at. And that'll become significant here in a minute. One thing you want to make sure is, on your motors, you want to make sure that this stem here in the middle, this spindle, it's the exact same spindle that goes all the way through and comes out. You need to make sure that that spindle is not sitting proud of that plane. So when you tighten those back down and you lay it down flat, it sits true to that surface. You don't want it to have a little bit sticking out, otherwise it won't sit flat. I have a motor here that doesn't sit flat to show you. Which one was it? Looks like it was number 4. Yeah, it's number 4. If I get a straight edge here, I can show you. Maybe you can see that, maybe you can't. But basically, that stem sits proud of that plane. That's a bad condition because you don't want the end of that to rub into the metal. It's going to rob you of power. So if there's nothing you can do to get rid of that condition, then you may want to consider drilling a small hole in the piece of wood here to give that spindle a place to turn. If you hold the motor and spin the outrunner, you'll see that turning. That turns the entire time your props are turning. So if you're rubbing on that wood the whole time, you're stealing power from your system. So if you can't fix that, then drill a small hole in here so that can spin freely. Now I'm going to mount this motor to the boom, and actually I don't want to use that one. I want to use number 1. 1 dot for 1 dot. When we mount the motor mount to the boom, these holes aren't set up in the best pattern, so you kind of have to fit it on the boom to give you the tightest fit. You don't want this to be loose in any way, shape, or form. So what I like to do, I like to take the motor out of the motor mount, loosen that up just enough to take the mount out. Comes right out. Set that aside for now. And when you locate the motor mount, the best way to do this is to use the bigger holes so that when you run your zip tie through, there's no slack in the zip tie. It's a little bit difficult to explain. Let me just show you. Get some zip ties out. I'm going to use the big holes, and I like to have the head on the bottom, so I'm going to run it up and over, and I'm just going to get 1 click on there, 1 or 2 clicks. Notice what side you have the head on. The next zip tie you do, put the head on the opposite side. So let's put that on there, see what that looks like. Now I can rotate that however I like it, fit it in the best possible position to tighten it down. So this hole and this hole become the best slots. So the head is on the forward side. I'm going to insert this one so the head is on the back side. Let's see, that's not going to work. I got to come up this way. Over, around, back down through that big hole. And put that head on the back side just so it peeks out the back. And then feed your zip tie through. Aircraft is walking on me. Where are you going? Get back over there. Alright, make sure the outside edge of the circle is just tangent to that outside face. And then tighten those zip ties down. Nice and tight. Don't break them. Just nice and tight. Let me show you what that looks like. See, it's still kind of loose. That is unacceptable. We got to get those as tight as possible. See if we can't tighten those up. It's still a little loose. I just spread them out just enough. I don't know if we're in the shot there, I can't tell. There we go. Spread those out and then try again. That's pretty tight. I guess we'll just go with that for now, see what happens. The reason why we don't want that, when we install the motor, when everything's inserted and you're ready to fly, the way the aircraft turns, whether it's turning left or right, or whether it's rolling or pitching, the way that happens is by using the torque of the motor that's induced into the airframe. So if the airframe wants to, if you want to turn, roll to your left or roll to your right, for instance, then you would decrease the RPM on these two and increase on these two to get it to roll. For a yaw, you would increase or decrease diagonally to get the airframe to yaw. Now this all happens in the flight controls. Nothing you have to worry about doing. The flight control does all that math for you. But what you don't want to do is have these so loose that your whole motor is torquing. That's no bueno. So now that we have that installed, I'm tightening those little screws on the side and making sure. So if you loosen it just enough, pull the motor out so that it hits the edge of the channel inside the motor, and then tighten it up. That will ensure that the end of your spindle is not rubbing on the wood inside. Let me show you that. So if I loosen these up just enough, let's take one out completely. Okay, so you see the channel. You see the channel here in the motor. And when it's inside this housing, when the screw comes out at the edge of the housing, it sits in this channel. And the idea is to have the edge of that screw riding on the inside of that channel. You pull up your motor as far as possible to keep that from touching the wood. I'll put that back together. You can see that installed. I like to have the wires perpendicular to the screws. Makes it much easier to adjust on the airframe. So I have it in there pushed all the way. I have it just touching the end of that shaft. Now I'm going to pull that housing down as far as possible so that when I tighten it, the screws bite on the edge of that face, and what that does, doing that process, gets that stem out of the way, so you're not sitting proud of that flat, and you won't lose power when it's mounted touching the boom. Okay, so we got number 1 motor installed. Got it zip tied in place. Go ahead and do that 3 more times. Alright, the aircraft is growing. It's getting a little bit more difficult to keep it in screen, but here we have all the motors installed. And now we're going to focus on installing the speed controls. Something to keep in mind when you're installing the speed controls, you don't want to install them in a place where if you crash, these things impact first. I had them mounted back here in the back like this. Actually, I had them sitting back here on the edge of the gussets, but we had a couple of impacts where it went in ground first just like that, and it crushed, or rather could crush, the speed controls. So I decided to mount the speed controls in between the gussets. So basically, when I connect the motors to the speed controls, I have to insert the speed control just like that, and I zip tie it to the post, and then I zip tie the motors down to the boom, zip tie the main component to the post, and then we'll work on these other wires here in a minute. Might be a good idea to try, if at all possible, mount it faced out. If you were to strip off this heat shrink, this piece right here is called a heat sink. It helps dissipate heat. So when you zip tie that on the inside, if at all possible, zip tie that so the face is facing out. When there's a prop on there, it'll blow air across. I'm going to go ahead and get one side installed. So when I do the speed control installation, I'm going to start with number 1. And as I mentioned, I like to keep the colors matching. It's a little bit difficult, especially if I have to have the face out. Then I'm going to cross some of these wires. So let's go ahead and then connect red to red, black to black, and then whatever's left over. Now I'm going to look at inserting the speed control. I'm going to look at inserting the speed control right here. Put those wires in there. Then I'll get a zip tie and zip tie that body to that post. You may find it necessary to take 2 zip ties and put them together so that when you fit that on the inside. And when you use your zip tie to hold it in place, you have enough room to fit and tight. Not so tight. You got some sensitive electronics in this thing. So just tight enough to hold it in place. And let's go ahead and put those wires on the inside. Rotate everything forward or back, whichever way. And just kind of snug those up. That should be good. Go ahead and do that 3 more times. Once you get one side just the way you like it, go ahead and zip tie these wires down. Help keep them from moving in flight. Don't want them to flex. I don't know if this is in shot or not, but I'm going to go ahead and zip tie this one down. Get some more zip ties. And let's go ahead and put a zip tie here. Maybe we'll put one right here too. Let's see how that looks. That should work. Don't want to crank those down because you can go through the wire. We don't want to do that. So let's go ahead and put one more right here. Get on there. There you go. And tighten that down. Not super tight, just to hold the wires. And go through and trim off the excess. Okay, we got one side done. Now go ahead and do the other side. Okay, I got the camera zoomed out pretty far, so hopefully everything can be seen. I have the speed controls. Oh, I forgot to clip one of those zip ties. There we go. Alright, I got the speed controls mounted on both sides. And now we can look at installing the power distribution harness. So here's where you got to make some decisions as well. Since we have number 1 over here, and we have already decided, excuse me, since number one forward, at this point we can decide where do we want the power distribution to come out from. We want it to come out from the sides, the bottom. You want it right in the middle. I don't know if it'll fit. Let's see what that looks like. Turn the aircraft upside down. We're going to feed all the positive and negative leads from the speed control underneath that tray. Let's see, that's a negative. There's a positive. And there's a positive. There's a negative. Come on now. Okay, so there's a positive and a negative from one speed control. Let's see if we can get all 4 of them at that point. Okay, so we still have the aircraft sitting upside down, and I've routed the speed control positive and negative wires underneath the battery tray, and it appears as if the power distribution cable is more than long enough to accommodate connecting to both front and rear. We're not going to need those extensions. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and connect all the positive and negative leads from the speed controls from both front and aft. Get those all connected and zip tied out of the way. Alright, so now we can see we have the power distribution harness installed in place. I have all the connectors soldered. I have all the connectors connected. And now we can move on to figuring out how we're going to connect our motors to the flight control. But before we do that, make sure you have your flight control set up through the mission planner. Make sure you get your firmware installed and go through the mission planner installation wizard. And the next time we come back to the video, we will be locating and installing the R2 Pilot flight controller onto the airframe.